The heavy wooden spoon slipped from Margaret Thornfield's trembling fingers, clattering against the kitchen floor like a gunshot in the pre-dawn silence. Her father stood in the doorway, his military bearing unchanged even in his nightclothes, watching his only daughter collapse against the cast-iron stove. This wasn't another one of his lectures about proper behavior or marriage prospects. Mrs. Cooper's scream pierced the morning air from the yard, her milk pail crashing to the ground as she witnessed the scene through the window. The ranch hands froze mid-step, their boots scraping against the wooden porch as they turned toward the commotion. Colonel Thornfield's weathered hands shook as he stared at his daughter's swollen face, remembering the bright-eyed little girl who used to greet him with warm biscuits after his long cattle drives. Now she could barely stand upright. "Get Jake Morrison," he commanded, his voice cracking with something between authority and desperation. "What kind of father forces his own flesh and blood to live like this? And how long before love becomes the very thing that destroys them both?" Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The San Joaquin Valley stretched endlessly under the California sun, its golden wheat fields rippling like an ocean of grain in the September heat of 1883. Here, where the Sierra Nevada mountains cast their long shadows across fertile farmland, the Thornfield Ranch had stood as a monument to prosperity for nearly 2 decades. But prosperity, like the morning mist that clung to the valley floor, could vanish without warning. Margaret Elizabeth Thornfield had once been the pride of Millbrook County, though pride was a word that tasted bitter in her mouth now. At 22, she carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had learned early that the world measured a woman's worth by the circumference of her waist rather than the breadth of her mind. Her auburn hair caught the light like burnished copper, and her green eyes held an intelligence that made the local schoolmarm envious. But at 240 pounds, packed onto her 5'4" frame, Maggie had become what polite society whispered about behind gloved hands and what impolite society mocked openly in the streets. The thyroid condition that had plagued her since childhood remained undiagnosed, dismissed by the family physician as nothing more than a lack of self-control. "The girl simply eats too much," Dr. Samuel Hammond would tell her father with the confidence of a man who had never questioned his own assumptions. What no one understood, what Maggie herself barely comprehended, was that her body had betrayed her in ways that went far deeper than appetite. Colonel James William Thornfield stood 6 feet 2 inches in his stockings, his graying beard meticulously trimmed despite the early hour. At 52, he carried himself with the rigid posture of a man who had commanded troops at Antietam and Gettysburg, who had watched boys younger than his own son march into cannon fire with songs on their lips. The war had ended 18 years ago, but it lived on in the set of his shoulders and the way his pale blue eyes never quite settled on anything for long. The loss of his son David at Gettysburg had carved something essential out of the colonel's chest, leaving behind a hollow space that no amount of whiskey or morning prayers could fill. His wife Sarah had died bringing Maggie into the world, and sometimes, in his darkest moments, he wondered if God was punishing him for some unnamed sin by taking his boy and leaving him with a daughter he didn't know how to love without breaking. The ranch itself sprawled across 15,000 acres of prime California soil, dotted with oak trees that had stood since before the Spanish missions. Cattle grazed in distant pastures while closer to the main house, fields of wheat and barley swayed in geometric precision. The white-painted mansion sat like a crown jewel at the property's heart, its wraparound porch and tall windows speaking of wealth earned through decades of back-breaking work and shrewd business decisions. But wealth, like reputation, could crumble faster than a house built on shifting sand, and in the autumn of 1883, the Thornfield empire was beginning to show its first cracks. The morning of March 3, 1882, dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of California sunshine that made even the most cynical heart believe in fresh starts. Margaret Thornfield stood before her bedroom mirror, adjusting the emerald silk dress that her seamstress had let out twice in the past year. The fabric strained across her shoulders and pulled tight at the waist, but it was the finest thing she owned, and today demanded her finest. Henry Wellington III was coming to call, and everyone in Millbrook County knew what that meant. The Wellington family owned the largest bank between Sacramento and Los Angeles, their wealth built on the dreams of gold miners and the sweat of railroad workers. Henry himself was considered quite the catch. 26 years old, Harvard-educated, with soft hands that had never known honest work and a mustache waxed to perfection. He had been circling the eligible daughters of the county like a hawk for months, and somehow, inexplicably, his attention had settled on Maggie. "Perhaps he sees beyond the surface," Mrs. Cooper had whispered hopefully while arranging fresh roses in the parlor. "Perhaps he sees your kind heart, dear." But Maggie knew better. She had caught the way Henry's eyes calculated when he looked at her, not with desire or even mild interest, but with the cold assessment of a man examining livestock. The Thornfield name still carried weight in California, and the Thornfield land was worth a fortune. Her body was simply the inconvenient wrapper around a very valuable package. The parlor had been transformed for the occasion, with the good china arranged on the mahogany tea table, and her mother's lace doilies draped over every available surface. Colonel Thornfield paced near the fireplace, his military bearing unable to disguise the nervous energy that crackled around him like electricity before a thunderstorm. His financial advisor had been increasingly insistent about advantageous alliances, though he never spoke such words directly to his daughter. When Henry arrived precisely at 2 o'clock, resplendent in a charcoal gray suit with a gold pocket watch chain, Maggie felt her stomach clench with something deeper than nervousness. He kissed her gloved hand with practiced gallantry, his lips barely grazing the silk, and settled himself in the chair across from her with the confidence of a man who had never been told no. "Miss Thornfield," he began, his voice carrying the cultured tones of expensive education, "I trust you know why I've come calling today." The conversation that followed was a masterpiece of social choreography. Henry speaking of his family's business interests, the Colonel nodding approvingly, and Maggie responding with the appropriate murmurs while her mind raced like a trapped bird. She watched Henry's hands as he gestured, noting how he unconsciously wiped his palms on his trousers after each time he touched her fingers. She observed the way his smile never quite reached his eyes when he looked at her, how he addressed most of his comments to her father rather than to her directly. When Henry finally dropped to one knee beside her chair, producing a diamond ring that caught the afternoon light like captured starfire, Maggie felt the walls of the parlor closing in around her. The words he spoke were everything a proposal should be: flowery declarations of devotion, promises of comfort and security, visions of a future filled with the finest things money could buy. "Miss Margaret Elizabeth Thornfield," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the suddenly airless room, "would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" The silence stretched between them, like a bridge over an abyss. Colonel Thornfield's breathing was audible in the stillness, and somewhere in the kitchen Mrs. Cooper had stopped her bustling to listen. Henry remained on his knee, the ring extended toward her like an offering to an unpredictable deity. Maggie looked at the ring, then at Henry's expectant face, then at her father's barely concealed desperation. She thought of her books upstairs, locked away now because Henry had mentioned that wives should focus on domestic concerns rather than masculine pursuits, like reading. She thought of the way he had already begun discussing which of her habits would need correction after their marriage. She thought of a lifetime of being grateful for scraps of affection from a man who saw her as a burden to be borne. "Mr. Wellington," she said finally, her voice steady despite the earthquake building in her chest. "I'd rather marry a rattlesnake. At least it would be honest about wanting to hurt me." The ring clattered to the floor as Henry lurched backward, his face cycling through shock, humiliation, and finally, rage. "You ungrateful—" he began, but Colonel Thornfield's sharp gesture silenced him. "Margaret," her father's voice carried a warning that made her spine straighten. "Perhaps you'd like to reconsider your hasty words." "No, Papa," she said, rising from her chair with a grace that surprised them all. "I believe I've been quite clear." Henry retrieved his ring with as much dignity as he could muster, his face flushed scarlet above his pristine collar. "Colonel Thornfield," he said through gritted teeth, "I wish you luck in finding someone desperate enough to take on such a challenging proposition." The front door slammed behind him with enough force to rattle the china in the cabinet, and in the sudden silence that followed, Maggie could hear her father's breathing grow sharp and shallow. When he finally turned to face her, his pale blue eyes held something she had never seen before, not disappointment, not anger, but a cold, calculating fury that made her blood turn to ice water in her veins. "You," he said quietly, "have just made the biggest mistake of your life." The study door closed behind Maggie with the finality of a coffin lid, and she found herself alone with her father in the room where he conducted all his most serious business. The walls were lined with leather-bound books that smelled of tobacco and old money, while mounted deer heads stared down from their eternal perches with glassy, accusatory eyes. Colonel Thornfield positioned himself behind his massive oak desk like a general preparing for battle, his hands flat against the polished surface as he studied his daughter with the cold assessment of a military strategist. "Sit down," he commanded, his voice carrying the authority that had once moved entire regiments across blood-soaked battlefields. Maggie remained standing, her emerald dress rustling softly in the oppressive silence. "I prefer to stand, thank you." "I wasn't making a request." The words cracked through the air like a bullwhip, and despite her resolve, Maggie found herself sinking into the uncomfortable wooden chair that faced his desk. It was the same chair where she had once sat as a child to receive praise for her excellent penmanship, the same chair where she had been lectured about proper behavior when she grew too fond of climbing trees with the ranch hand's children. Colonel Thornfield walked to the window that overlooked the main courtyard, his reflection ghost-like in the afternoon glass. For a long moment he said nothing, allowing the weight of his displeasure to settle over the room like dust. When he finally spoke, his voice was deceptively calm. "Do you have any idea what you've just done, Margaret?" "I've refused to marry a man who sees me as nothing more than a business transaction," she replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. He turned from the window and she saw something in his expression that made her stomach clench with dread. It wasn't the hot anger she had expected, but something far more dangerous. A cold, calculated fury that spoke of decisions already made and consequences already planned. "Henry Wellington represents one of the most powerful families in California," he said, each word measured and precise. "His father controls the financing for half the ranches in this valley, including ours. Do you understand what your little display of pride has cost us?" Maggie felt the first flutter of real fear, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. "I understand that I won't be sold like a prize heifer to shore up your business dealings." The slap came so quickly she barely saw his hand move. Her head snapped to the side, and the taste of copper flooded her mouth as her teeth cut into her tongue. The sting spread across her cheek like wildfire, but it was the shock more than the pain that brought tears to her eyes. "You will not speak to me with such disrespect," Colonel Thornfield said, his voice deadly quiet. "I am your father, and you will remember your place in this household." Maggie touched her fingers to her burning cheek, feeling the heat radiating from her skin. "My place," she repeated, the words bitter as wormwood on her tongue. "Yes, your place." He returned to his position behind the desk, his composure restored as if the moment of violence had never occurred. Which, given your behavior today, needs some serious adjustment. He opened the desk drawer and withdrew a sheet of paper covered in his precise military handwriting. I've been giving considerable thought to your future, Margaret. Your refusal to marry, your stubborn insistence on reading books that fill your head with inappropriate ideas, your complete disregard for the feminine graces that might make you acceptable to decent society. The paper rustled as he set it down between them, and Maggie could see rows of what looked like rules or regulations written in his familiar script. "What is that?" "Your new schedule," he said simply. "Effective immediately, you will no longer be living as the pampered daughter of this house. If you insist on rejecting the role of a lady, then perhaps some honest work will teach you to appreciate the alternatives." Maggie's breath caught in her throat as she read the first few lines. 4 o'clock morning wake-up, field work from dawn to dusk, meals with the hired hands, sleeping quarters in the servants' wing. "You can't be serious," she whispered, the words barely audible above the thundering of her own heartbeat. "I am perfectly serious." Colonel Thornfield leaned back in his chair, his pale eyes never leaving her face. "You want to act like you're too good for decent men? Fine. We'll see how good you are with indecent work. Perhaps a few months of real labor will cure you of your romantic notions about independence." The room seemed to tilt around her as the full implications of his words sank in. "Papa, please." "Don't." The single word cut through her plea like a blade. "You made your choice in that parlor, Margaret. Now you'll live with the consequences. I've already spoken with Jake Morrison. He'll be your supervisor. Make sure you earn your keep around here." Jake Morrison. Maggie knew him by sight, a quiet man with war scars etched into his face and hands that spoke of hard labor. He worked as the ranch foreman, respected by the other hands but keeping mostly to himself. The thought of being placed under his authority, of being reduced to the status of common help, made her cheeks burn with humiliation. "You think you're too proud to accept a good man's proposal?" Colonel Thornfield continued, his voice growing stronger as he warmed to his theme. "We'll see how proud you are when you're mucking out stalls and hauling water like the rest of the help. Maybe then you'll understand what real life is like for women who don't have the luxury of choosing their circumstances." Maggie stared at the paper in front of her, the words blurring as tears gathered in her eyes. "How long?" she managed to ask. "Until you come to your senses," he replied coldly. "Until you're ready to apologize to Henry Wellington and beg him to reconsider his generous offer. Until you learn that a woman's pride is a luxury this family can no longer afford." He stood up, indicating that the conversation was over. "You'll start tomorrow morning, Mrs. Cooper will show you to your new quarters tonight. And Margaret?" He paused at the door, his hand on the brass knob. "Don't think for one moment that this gives you some romantic notion about the working life. This isn't freedom, it's punishment. And it will continue until you remember who you are and where you belong." The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving Maggie alone with the dying afternoon light and the terrible understanding that her life, as she had known it, was over. The servants' quarters occupied a long, low building behind the main house, constructed of rough-hewn timber and whitewashed boards that had faded to the color of old bones. Maggie stood in the doorway of what would be her new home, clutching a single carpet bag that contained the few practical clothes Mrs. Cooper had managed to find for her. The room was spartanly furnished, a narrow cot with a thin mattress, a washstand with a chipped porcelain basin, and a single wooden chair that had seen better decades. "I've put extra blankets in the chest," Mrs. Cooper said quietly, her weathered hands smoothing the rough wool coverlet with unnecessary precision. The housekeeper's eyes were red-rimmed, and she kept her voice low as if speaking too loudly might make this nightmare more real. "And there's a bar of soap and a clean towel. I'll I'll try to bring you better meals when the Colonel isn't watching." Maggie set down her bag and touched the older woman's shoulder gently. "You mustn't risk your position for me, Mrs. Cooper. I'll manage." "This isn't right," Mrs. Cooper whispered fiercely. 22 years I've worked for this family, and I've never seen anything like this. Your dear mother would be spinning in her grave." The mention of her mother brought a fresh wave of grief, but Maggie pushed it down. She couldn't afford to break now, not when tomorrow would bring challenges she could barely imagine. "Perhaps this will all blow over in a few days," she said, though the words tasted like lies even as she spoke them. Mrs. Cooper shook her head sadly. "I've seen that look in your father's eyes before, child. During the war, when he made decisions he knew would cost lives but had to make them anyway. He's convinced himself this is for your own good, and that makes him more dangerous than simple anger ever could." The 4 o'clock bell clanged across the ranch like a death knell, dragging Maggie from the fitful sleep that had finally claimed her sometime after midnight. Her body ached in places she hadn't known could ache, and the thin mattress had left her feeling as though she'd spent the night on a pile of rocks. Through the single window she could see the faint gray light of false dawn painting the eastern sky. Jake Morrison stood waiting outside the servants' quarters, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the morning mist. He held his hat in his hands, turning it nervously as she emerged from the building, and she could see the discomfort written plainly across his scarred features. Up close, he was younger than she had initially thought, perhaps 30 at most, with dark brown hair that curled slightly at his collar and gray eyes that held a depth of pain she recognized from her own mirror. "Miss Thornfield," he said quietly, his voice carrying a slight Tennessee drawl that spoke of origins far from California's golden valleys. I'm real sorry about this situation. Your father, he told me to make sure you learned proper work habits. But I want you to know, I take no pleasure in it." She studied his face, searching for signs of the cruelty or mockery she had expected, but found only genuine distress. "Mr. Morrison, I understand you're simply following orders. I don't blame you for my father's decisions." Relief flickered across his features, followed immediately by something that might have been guilt. "All the same, I'll try to make this as easy as I can without—" He gestured helplessly toward the main house, where a light burned in Colonel Thornfield's study window. "Without defying him directly," Maggie finished. "I understand." The first weeks of her new life blurred together in a haze of physical exhaustion and burning humiliation. Her soft hands, which had never known work harder than needlepoint, blistered and bled from handling rake handles and shovel grips. Her back ached constantly from bending over vegetable rows and hauling water buckets that seemed to grow heavier with each step. The simple act of rising from her cot each morning became an exercise in willpower, as every muscle in her body screamed its protest against another day of labor, but it was the stairs that proved hardest to bear. The other ranch hands watched her with a mixture of pity and curiosity, unsure how to treat the Colonel's daughter who had suddenly appeared among them wearing patched work clothes and carrying a lunch pail like any common laborer. Some whispered among themselves when they thought she couldn't hear, their voices carrying snatches of speculation about what she had done to deserve such treatment. Jake proved to be a surprisingly considerate supervisor, assigning her tasks that were difficult enough to satisfy any watching eyes, but not so impossible as to break her completely. When she struggled to lift a particularly heavy bucket, he would casually take it from her hands while pretending to check its contents. When her blistered palms began to bleed, he showed her how to wrap them with strips of cloth torn from an old shirt. "My sister used to get blisters like that when she helped with the harvest," he said one afternoon, watching her fumble with the makeshift bandages. "Mary Beth, she was about your age when the fever took her, stubborn as a mule and twice as smart." It was the first personal information he had shared, and Maggie found herself curious about this quiet man who seemed to carry sadness like a familiar burden. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said softly. "Been near 10 years now," he replied, his gray eyes distant. "Sometimes seems like yesterday, sometimes like a lifetime ago. Funny how grief works. It changes shape on you, but it never really goes away." As the days stretched into weeks, Maggie began to notice things about ranch life that had been invisible to her from the sheltered perspective of the main house. She saw how hard the Mexican workers labored for wages that barely fed their families, how they were treated with casual dismissal by the white hands, despite their superior skill with horses and cattle. She witnessed the quiet dignity of the older workers who had given their best years to the Thornfield Ranch, only to find themselves disposable when age began to slow their pace. Most unsettling of all, she began to understand the true precariousness of her father's financial situation. Conversations overheard in the bunkhouse painted a picture of mounting debts, failed investments, and creditors who were growing increasingly impatient. The railroad speculation that had seemed so promising 2 years ago had collapsed spectacularly, taking with it the savings of dozens of ranchers who had trusted their futures to paper promises and Eastern financiers. "Heard tell the Colonel owes near $20,000 to the bank," one of the hands murmured during their midday break. "Railroad stock ain't worth the paper it's printed on now." "20,000?" Another whistled low. "That's more money than I'll see in 10 lifetimes." Maggie kept her head down, pretending to focus on her meager lunch, but her mind raced with the implications. $20,000, a sum so vast it seemed almost abstract, yet apparently real enough to drive her father to desperate measures. No wonder he had been so furious about her rejection of Henry Wellington. The marriage wasn't just about social advancement. It was about survival. The realization brought with it a complex mixture of emotions. Part of her felt vindicated in her refusal to be sold for her father's debts, but another part, the part that had been raised to think of family duty above personal desire, whispered that perhaps she was being selfish. How many people depended on the ranch for their livelihoods? How many families would suffer if the Thornfield empire collapsed? It was during her 6th week of exile that she first found herself truly alone with Jake Morrison. The other workers had finished their tasks and returned to the bunkhouse for their evening meal, but Maggie still struggled with a section of fence that had been damaged by a spooked horse. Her hands shook with exhaustion as she tried to maneuver the heavy wooden post into position, and she could feel tears of frustration burning behind her eyes. "Here, let me help with that," Jake said quietly, appearing beside her as if from nowhere. His strong hands took the weight of the post, steadying it while she attempted to secure the wire. "I can manage," she said through gritted teeth, though they both knew it was a lie. "I'm sure you can," he replied diplomatically, "but there's no shame in accepting help when it's offered." They worked in companionable silence for several minutes, their movements gradually synchronizing as they repaired the damaged fence. Maggie found herself acutely aware of his presence, the careful way he moved to avoid crowding her, the quiet competence of his hands as they manipulated the tools, the clean scent of soap and honest sweat that clung to his clothes. "Mr. Morrison," she said suddenly, surprising herself with the question that tumbled from her lips. "Do you think I'm a terrible person?" He paused in his work, looking at her with those serious gray eyes. "Why would you ask such a thing?" "Because I refused to marry Henry Wellington, knowing it might ruin my father financially. Because I chose my own pride over my family's welfare." The words came faster now, as if a dam had burst inside her chest. "Because I'm sitting here feeling sorry for myself when there are people who depend on this ranch for their survival." Jake was quiet for a long moment, his calloused hands still gripping the fence post. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "Miss Thornfield, can I ask you something?" Do you think your father is a terrible person?" The question caught her off guard. "Of course not. He's doing what he thinks is best, even if I don't agree with his methods. But he's treating his own daughter like a common laborer, working you near to death because you wouldn't marry a man you don't love. If another father did that to his child, what would you think of him?" Maggie opened her mouth to defend her father, then closed it as the implications of Jake's words sank in. "That's different," she said weakly. "Is it?" Jake secured the final wire and stepped back to examine their work. "Seems to me that good people can do terrible things when they're desperate or scared or hurting. And terrible people can sometimes do good things for bad reasons. The world ain't as simple as we'd like it to be." They began gathering their tools as the last light faded from the western sky. Maggie found herself thinking about Jake's words, turning them over in her mind like smooth stones. And there was wisdom in what he had said, a kind of hard-earned understanding that came from someone who had seen both the best and worst of human nature. "Mr. Morrison," she said as they walked back toward the ranch buildings, "may I ask what happened to your face?" The scars were clearly old, white lines that tracked across his left cheek and disappeared into his hairline. His hand moved unconsciously to touch the marks, a gesture so habitual he probably wasn't aware of it. "Shrapnel from a cannon burst at Chickamauga. I was lucky. Lost most of my hearing in my left ear, but kept my eye. Saw plenty of boys who weren't so fortunate." "Were you very young when you enlisted?" 17 when I signed up, 21 when I mustered out. Felt like I'd lived 100 years in between." He glanced at her sideways. "War has a way of aging a man's soul faster than his body. Makes you realize how precious ordinary things are. Hot meals, clean beds, people who care whether you live or die." They had reached the servants' quarters, and Maggie paused with her hand on the rough wooden door. "Thank you," she said simply. "For what?" "For treating me like a person instead of a problem to be solved." Jake's scarred face softened into something that might have been a smile. "Miss Thornfield, you're the furthest thing from a problem I've ever seen. You're the strongest woman I've ever met, and that's saying something, considering I grew up with Mary Beth." As she watched him walk away toward the main bunkhouse, Maggie felt something stirring in her chest that she hadn't experienced since childhood. The warm glow of being truly seen and valued by another human being. It was a dangerous feeling, she knew, given her circumstances and the vast social gulf that separated them. But for the first time since this nightmare had begun, she allowed herself to hope that perhaps she wasn't as alone as she had thought. The night air carried the distant sound of a harmonica from the bunkhouse, a melancholy tune that spoke of homesickness and dreams deferred. Maggie stood in her doorway for a long moment, listening to the music and watching the stars emerge in the vast California sky. Tomorrow would bring another day of backbreaking labor, another test of her endurance and resolve. But tonight, for just a few precious moments, she felt almost human again. The first sign that something had shifted came on a sweltering August morning when Maggie collapsed in the middle of the wheat field, her body finally succumbing to months of relentless labor and inadequate nutrition. One moment she was wielding her scythe with the mechanical precision born of endless repetition, and the next she was face down in the golden stubble, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird, desperate for escape. Jake reached her before anyone else, his boots pounding across the hard-packed earth as he dropped to his knees beside her motionless form. "Get some water," he barked at the nearest worker, his hands already checking for signs of life. Her pulse was rapid and thready beneath his fingertips, and her skin burned with fever despite the early hour. "Miss Thornfield, Maggie, can you hear me?" The use of her given name slipped out unconsciously, a breach of propriety that would have horrified him under normal circumstances. But these weren't normal circumstances, and the woman lying unconscious in his arms had long since ceased to be merely his employer's daughter. When her eyes finally fluttered open, they were unfocused and glassy with confusion. "Jake?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the morning breeze that rustled through the wheat. I can't catch my breath." "You're going to be fine," he said, with more confidence than he felt. "Just rest now. Don't try to talk." But even as he spoke the reassuring words, Jake's mind was racing with darker possibilities. He had seen men collapse like this during the war, strong soldiers brought low by exhaustion, poor food, and the relentless stress of survival. Some had recovered with rest and proper care. Others had simply closed their eyes one day and never opened them again. Dr. Samuel Hammond arrived at the ranch within the hour, summoned by Mrs. Cooper's frantic message. He was a small, precise man with thinning hair and spectacles that perpetually slipped down his nose, giving him the appearance of a scholarly bird. His medical bag was worn but well maintained, and his hands were steady as he examined Maggie in the privacy of her small room. Jake waited outside like a sentinel, his shoulders rigid with tension as he listened to the murmured conversation within. When the doctor finally emerged, his expression was carefully neutral in the way that medical men learn to perfect when delivering unwelcome news. "Well?" Jake asked, though part of him dreaded the answer. Dr. Hammond removed his spectacles and cleaned them with meticulous care, a gesture that Jake was beginning to recognize as a stalling tactic. "Miss Thornfield is suffering from severe exhaustion and what appears to be a significant thyroid condition. Her heart rate is dangerously elevated and she's showing signs of malnourishment despite her substantial frame." "What does that mean in plain English, Doc?" The physician's mouth tightened almost imperceptibly. "It means that without proper rest and treatment, she could suffer permanent damage to her heart, or worse." Jake felt something cold settle in his stomach. "And with proper treatment?" "The thyroid condition is chronic and will require ongoing medical supervision. As for the exhaustion..." Dr. Hammond glanced toward the main house where Colonel Thornfield's silhouette was visible in his study window. "That would require a significant change in her current circumstances." The implication hung between them like smoke from a green fire. Jake followed the doctor's gaze toward the mansion, where Maggie's father continued his daily routine as if his daughter hadn't just collapsed from the labor he had imposed upon her. "I'll need to speak with the colonel about her treatment," Dr. Hammond said quietly. "No." The word came out sharper than Jake had intended. "Let me talk to him first." The doctor studied Jake's face with new interest, noting the protective set of his jaw and the way his hands had unconsciously clenched into fists. "Mr. Morrison, I hope you understand the delicate nature of this situation. Miss Thornfield's condition is serious, but her father is still my patient as well. I have obligations." "Your obligation is to keep people alive," Jake interrupted. "Or did they teach you something different in medical school?" Dr. Hammond's face flushed, but before he could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps made both men turn. Colonel Thornfield strode across the courtyard with military precision, his expression unreadable as he approached the servants' quarters. "Doctor," he said curtly, nodding to Dr. Hammond while pointedly ignoring Jake. "I trust my daughter is simply suffering from the vapors. Perhaps a bit of laudanum to settle her nerves." "Colonel, I'm afraid it's more serious than that." Dr. Hammond's voice carried a carefully professional tone. "Miss Thornfield has a significant thyroid condition that has gone untreated for some time. Combined with the physical strain she's been under, it's created a dangerous situation." The colonel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "And your recommendation?" "Complete bed rest for at least 2 weeks, followed by a gradual return to light activities only. She'll also need medication to regulate her thyroid function and a diet designed to support her recovery." "I see." Colonel Thornfield's pale eyes shifted briefly to Jake, who stood rigid with barely contained fury. "And if she doesn't receive this treatment?" Dr. Hammond hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. The strain on her heart could be permanent. In extreme cases, it could be fatal. The silence that followed seemed to stretch for an eternity. Jake watched the colonel's face, searching for some sign of paternal concern, some indication that the news of his daughter's condition had penetrated the armor of his stubborn pride. What he saw instead made his blood run cold. "Doctor," the colonel said finally, his voice carrying the same tone he might use to discuss the weather, "I appreciate your professional opinion. However, I believe that what my daughter needs is not coddling, but the discipline that comes from honest work. She's been pampered all her life, and it's made her weak. A little hardship will strengthen her constitution." "Colonel Thornfield," Dr. Hammond began, his voice sharp with professional alarm, "I must strongly advise against—" "Your advice is noted," the colonel cut him off, "but the decision is mine to make. Margaret will continue her current routine. If she's truly ill, then hard work will either cure her or reveal the depths of her weakness." Jake stepped forward, his control finally snapping. "Are you insane? Your own daughter could die, and you're talking about discipline?" The colonel turned to face him fully for the first time, and Jake found himself looking into eyes that held all the warmth of winter steel. "Mr. Morrison, you seem to have forgotten your place. You work for me, not the other way around. If you're not satisfied with my decisions regarding my family, you're free to seek employment elsewhere." "Maybe I will," Jake shot back, his Tennessee drawl thickening with emotion. "Maybe I'll take her with me, somewhere she can get the care she needs from people who actually give a damn about her welfare." The threat hung in the air between them like a loaded weapon. Colonel Thornfield's hand moved unconsciously toward the service revolver he still wore on his hip, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed by either Jake or Dr. Hammond. "That," the colonel said with deadly quiet, "would be inadvisable. Margaret is my daughter, and she will remain on this ranch under my authority. Any attempt to remove her against my wishes would be considered kidnapping, and I would pursue the matter through every legal avenue available to me." Jake's hands clenched and unclenched at his sides as he wrestled with the urge to solve this problem in the direct, violent manner he had learned during 4 years of war. But violence would only make things worse for Maggie, and she had already suffered enough. "You're killing her," he said finally, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Your own flesh and blood, and you're killing her as sure as if you put a gun to her head." "I'm making her strong," the colonel replied. "Something her mother was too weak to do, and something I should have done years ago. If she dies, then she was never worthy of the Thornfield name to begin with." The words hit Jake like a physical blow, and he saw Dr. Hammond recoil as if he had been slapped. Even for a man hardened by war and loss, the casual cruelty of the statement was breathtaking. "Get out," the colonel continued, his voice never rising above conversational volume. "Both of you. Margaret will receive no special treatment, no medication, and no coddling. She will work until she learns her place, or until she proves that she lacks the strength to deserve a place at all." Dr. Hammond packed his medical bag with shaking hands, his face pale with shock. "Colonel, I must protest this decision in the strongest possible terms. As a physician, I cannot in good conscience—" "Then don't." The colonel's interruption was final. "Consider your services no longer required for this matter." As the doctor hurried away toward his buggy, Jake remained standing in the courtyard, his gray eyes locked on the colonel's face. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "No," Colonel Thornfield agreed. "It isn't. But when it is, you'll understand that everything I've done has been for Margaret's own good. A father's love sometimes requires hard choices, Mr. Morrison. Perhaps someday you'll have children of your own and understand." With that, he turned and walked back toward the main house, leaving Jake alone with his rage and a growing certainty that he was watching a man destroy everything he claimed to love in the name of saving it. Through the thin walls of the servants' quarters, he could hear Maggie's labored breathing, and he knew that time was running out faster than either of them had realized. That night, as Jake sat beside Maggie's cot while she drifted in and out of feverish sleep, he made a decision that would change both their lives forever. Whatever it took, whatever the cost, he would not stand by and watch her die for the sake of one man's twisted notion of paternal love. The war had taught him many things, but perhaps the most important lesson was this: sometimes a man had to choose between following orders and following his conscience, and Jake Morrison had already seen too much death to stand idly by while another innocent person was sacrificed on the altar of someone else's pride. The escape attempt came 3 weeks after Maggie's collapse, on a moonless night when thick clouds rolled in from the Pacific to shroud the valley in darkness. Jake had spent days planning their route, studying the mountain passes that led toward Sacramento and the possibility of a new life beyond the reach of Colonel Thornfield's influence. He had saved every penny of his wages for months, accumulating enough money to buy train tickets and perhaps a few weeks' lodging while they established themselves in the city. Maggie's condition had deteriorated steadily despite Jake's covert efforts to provide her with better food and lighter work assignments. Her face had grown gaunt, the healthy roundness replaced by the hollow-cheeked appearance of chronic illness. Her hands trembled constantly now, and she often had to stop mid-task to catch her breath, leaning against fence posts or barn walls while waves of dizziness washed over her. "I won't be the cause of you losing your position," she had whispered when Jake first broached the idea of leaving together. They were alone in the barn, ostensibly checking on a mare that had shown signs of lameness, but really stealing a few precious moments of private conversation. "You're not the cause of anything," Jake replied firmly, his hands gentle as he helped her sit on a bale of hay. "This is my choice, Maggie. I can't stay here and watch him kill you slowly." The use of her given name had become natural between them over the weeks of shared hardship, though they were careful never to let such intimacy show when others might be listening. Their relationship had evolved in the shadow of her father's cruelty, built on mutual respect and growing affection that neither dared voice aloud. But where would we go? What would we do? The practical concerns that had kept her awake nights spilled out in a rush. "I have no skills except needlework and reading." "You're giving up steady work with no guarantee of finding anything better." Jake knelt beside her, his scarred hands covering her trembling ones. "I've got enough saved to get us to San Francisco. There's work there for a man who's not afraid of labor, and you could teach children maybe. You've got more education than most folks out here." The plan was simple enough in concept, but fraught with danger in execution. They would leave after midnight, when the ranch hands were deep in sleep, and the night watch was focused on protecting the cattle from predators rather than preventing escapes. Jake had hidden supplies in an old line shack in the foothills, food, blankets, and his small savings wrapped in oiled cloth. From there, they would make their way through the mountain passes to the railroad depot at Auburn, where they could catch a train west to the coast. But simplicity in planning didn't account for the human element, particularly the festering resentment of Dr. Samuel Hammond, who had never forgiven the world for the death of his closest friend at Gettysburg. David Thornfield had been like a brother to Hammond during their boyhood, and David's death had left a wound in the doctor's soul that had never properly healed. In his twisted logic, Margaret's very existence was an affront to his friend's memory. She had lived while David died, prospered while his dreams turned to dust in a Georgia field. When Mrs. Cooper mentioned in passing that she had seen Jake and Margaret talking quietly near the barn, Hammond's suspicions crystallized into certainty. He began watching them with the intensity of a man seeking confirmation of his worst fears. Noting the protective way Jake positioned himself near Margaret during work, the careful manner in which he assisted her with heavy tasks, the lingering looks that passed between them when they thought no one was observing. On the night of their planned escape, Hammond was waiting in the shadows near the servants' quarters, a loaded shotgun cradled in his arms and righteousness burning in his chest like a fever. He had already alerted Colonel Thornfield to his suspicions, painting a picture of seduction and betrayal that played perfectly into the colonel's existing fears about his daughter's moral character. Margaret emerged from her room at midnight, carrying a small bundle of her few possessions and moving with the careful quiet of someone who understood that discovery meant disaster. Jake waited for her near the corral, 2 horses saddled and ready for the journey ahead. For a moment, standing in the pale starlight with freedom almost within reach, they both allowed themselves to believe that escape was possible. "Are you certain about this?" Jake whispered as he helped her mount the smaller of the 2 horses. "Once we leave, there's no going back." "Your father will never forgive either of us." Margaret looked back at the dark windows of the main house, where the man who had given her life now seemed determined to take it away through cruelty disguised as love. "There's nothing here to go back to," she said quietly. "Whatever happens, it can't be worse than dying slowly in the name of family duty." They had made it perhaps 2 miles from the ranch buildings, following deer trails through the oak groves that dotted the hillsides, when the sound of pursuing hoofbeats shattered the night silence. Jake cursed under his breath, recognizing the distinctive rhythm of multiple horses moving at speed. Colonel Thornfield had organized a proper posse, complete with lanterns and tracking skills that made concealment nearly impossible. "This way," Jake hissed, leading Margaret's horse off the established trail and into the thick underbrush that choked the canyon bottom. Branches tore at their clothes and faces as they pushed deeper into the wilderness, the sounds of pursuit growing closer with each passing minute. They took shelter in a small cave hollowed out by centuries of winter runoff, pressing themselves against the cold stone walls while voices echoed from the trail above. Margaret's breathing was labored from the exertion, and Jake could feel the trembling in her body that spoke of exhaustion and fear. "Margaret!" Colonel Thornfield's voice carried clearly through the thin mountain air, amplified by the canyon walls. "I know you're out there, and I know you're with that Morrison fellow. Come back now, and we'll discuss this like civilized people." Jake felt Margaret stiffen beside him at the false reasonableness in her father's tone. They both knew that civilized discussion was the last thing the colonel had in mind. "You're making a mistake, daughter," the colonel continued, his voice growing harder as no response came from the darkness. "This man has filled your head with romantic nonsense, but he's using you for his own purposes. He knows that helping you escape will make him valuable to my enemies. He's not trying to save you, he's trying to sell you." The accusation hit Margaret like a physical blow, and Jake felt her pull away from him slightly. In the darkness he couldn't see her expression, but he could sense the doubt that her father's words had planted in her mind. "Don't listen to him," Jake whispered urgently. "You know that's not true. You know why I'm doing this." But the damage was done. The seeds of uncertainty had been planted in soil already prepared by years of psychological manipulation, and Margaret found herself wondering if she had been naive to trust a man who owed her nothing and stood to gain what? Her father was right about one thing. Helping her escape would certainly make Jake valuable to anyone who wanted to strike at the Thornfield family. The posse found them at dawn, guided by Dr. Hammond's keen eyes and bitter determination. Margaret and Jake were dragged from their hiding place like common criminals, their hands bound with rope, while Colonel Thornfield looked on with an expression of profound disappointment that somehow hurt worse than his anger would have. "I'm sorry it came to this, Margaret," he said, as they loaded her onto a horse for the journey back to the ranch. But perhaps now you'll understand the consequences of placing your trust in the wrong people." Jake tried to catch her eye as they prepared to separate them, but Margaret kept her gaze fixed on the ground, her spirit as broken as her body. The escape that was supposed to be their salvation had become the final proof of her powerlessness, and the man she had begun to love was now just another source of shame in her father's catalog of her failures. As they rode back toward the Thornfield ranch in the gray light of dawn, Margaret realized that her brief taste of hope had made her current situation infinitely more bitter. Freedom, once glimpsed, became a torture rather than a dream, and she understood with crystalline clarity that her father had won more than just this particular battle. He had broken something inside her that might never heal. The root cellar beneath the main house had been carved from living rock during the ranch's early days, designed to keep vegetables cool during California's scorching summers. Now it served as Margaret's prison, a damp, windowless tomb that smelled of earth and decay. The only light came from a narrow gap beneath the heavy wooden door, and the only furniture was a straw mattress that had seen better decades and a wooden bucket that served purposes she tried not to contemplate. Colonel Thornfield visited her twice daily, descending the stone steps with the measured tread of a man convinced of his own righteousness. He brought thin gruel and stale bread, setting the meager portions just within her reach before settling himself on the bottom step to deliver his lectures on duty, obedience, and the price of defiance. "This is what comes of romantic foolishness," he said on the third morning of her confinement, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "You allowed that man to fill your head with dreams of escape, and now you see where such dreams lead." Margaret sat in the farthest corner of the cellar, her knees drawn up to her chest and her arms wrapped around her legs for warmth. The thin cotton dress she wore provided little protection against the damp chill that seemed to seep from the very stones themselves. She had stopped responding to her father's monologues after the first day, recognizing them for what they were, not attempts at communication but performances designed to justify his actions to himself. "Your mother never gave me such trouble," the colonel continued, warming to his theme. "Sarah understood a woman's place in the world. She knew that sometimes sacrifice is necessary for the greater good of the family." The mention of her mother sparked something in Margaret's dulled consciousness. "My mother died bringing me into this world," she said, her voice hoarse from disuse. "How do you know what she would have understood about anything?" Colonel Thornfield's face darkened at her words. "Your mother was a lady, which is more than I can say for her daughter. She never would have entertained romantic notions about running away with hired help. Maybe she would have if she'd lived long enough to see what kind of man she married." The slap came without warning, Colonel Thornfield's open palm cracking across her cheek with enough force to snap her head to the side. Stars burst behind her eyes, and the taste of blood filled her mouth where her teeth cut into her tongue. "You will not speak of your mother with such disrespect," he said coldly, "and you will not question my authority in this house." Margaret touched her fingers to her burning cheek, feeling the heat radiating from her skin. "What authority?" she asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "The authority to slowly murder your own daughter? The authority to destroy everything you claim to love?" "I'm saving you," Colonel Thornfield replied, though something in his eyes suggested he was no longer entirely convinced of his own words. "Teaching you the lessons you should have learned years ago." "You're killing me," Margaret said simply, "and we both know it." Above them, unbeknownst to either father or daughter, Jake Morrison was conducting his own investigation into the ranch's affairs. The failed escape attempt had cost him his position as foreman, but Colonel Thornfield had been reluctant to dismiss him entirely. Jake's war experience and natural leadership made him too valuable to waste, even if he could no longer be trusted with authority. Relegated to the most menial tasks on the ranch, Jake found himself with access to parts of the property he had never seen before. It was while cleaning out an old storage building that he discovered a cache of documents that painted a very different picture of the Thornfield family's situation than anyone had suspected. The papers were yellowed with age and tied with ribbon that had faded from red to dusty pink. Most were letters, written in a feminine hand that Jake didn't recognize, but a few were official documents: a marriage certificate, a birth certificate, and most intriguingly, a will that bore Margaret's mother's signature. Sarah Thornfield's final testament made for fascinating reading. Far from being the passive, obedient wife that her husband had described, she had been a woman of considerable intelligence and foresight. The will revealed that she had inherited substantial property from her own family, land that legally belonged to Margaret upon her 21st birthday, not to her father. But it was the letters that truly opened Jake's eyes to the dynamics of the Thornfield marriage. Written to Sarah's sister in Boston, they painted a picture of a woman trapped in an increasingly abusive relationship with a man whose war experiences had left him damaged and dangerous. "James grows more volatile with each passing month," one letter read. "He speaks constantly of David's future in the military, as if our son's life exists solely to vindicate his own experiences in the war. I fear what will happen when David is old enough to have opinions of his own." Another letter, written shortly before Margaret's birth, was even more revealing. "I have made a terrible mistake in my marriage, dear sister, but it is too late to remedy it now. I can only hope that the child I carry will find the strength to escape the cage I have built around us both." The final letter, dated just weeks before Sarah's death, contained a revelation that made Jake's blood run cold. "James has been meeting with Dr. Hammond about my condition. They speak of me as if I am already dead, planning for a future in which my husband will have complete control over my children and my property. I have hidden this will where they cannot find it, in hopes that someday it might serve to protect my daughter from her father's ambitions." Jake carefully returned the documents to their hiding place, his mind racing with the implications of what he had discovered. Margaret was not the helpless dependent her father had made her out to be. She was a woman of considerable means, if only she could claim her inheritance. More importantly, her mother's letters suggested that Colonel Thornfield's treatment of his daughter was part of a pattern of abuse that had begun years before Margaret's birth. Meanwhile, in the root cellar, Margaret's condition continued to deteriorate. The combination of poor food, damp conditions, and emotional stress was taking a devastating toll on her already fragile health. Her thyroid condition, left untreated for months, had progressed to the point where her heart struggled to maintain a steady rhythm. She found herself gasping for breath after the slightest exertion, and her hands shook so badly that she could barely hold the tin cup her father brought with her daily ration of water. It was Mrs. Cooper who finally broke the conspiracy of silence that surrounded Margaret's imprisonment. The housekeeper had watched in growing horror as Colonel Thornfield descended into the cellar each day, returning with empty food bowls and increasingly wild justifications for his daughter's continued confinement. "She's learning valuable lessons about the consequences of defiance," he explained when Mrs. Cooper questioned the length of Margaret's punishment. "A few more days of reflection will cure her of her romantic notions." But Mrs. Cooper had worked for the Thornfield family for over 20 years, and she had seen enough of life to recognize the difference between discipline and cruelty. When she encountered Jake near the barn one evening, she made a decision that would change everything. "She's dying down there," she said without preamble, her weathered face etched with lines of worry and guilt. "I can hear her coughing through the floorboards, and it gets worse every day." Jake felt his stomach clench at her words. "How long has she been in the cellar?" 2 weeks, come Sunday," Mrs. Cooper replied. And the colonel shows no signs of relenting. He talks about her like she's already dead, planning what he'll do with the ranch when she's gone. The callousness of it struck Jake like a physical blow. He's planning for her death? Been meeting with that banker Wellington about selling off parcels of land. Says he needs to settle his debts before they multiply. Mrs. Cooper's voice dropped to a whisper. I think he's given up on her ever coming around to his way of thinking. I think he's decided it's easier to let her die than to admit he was wrong. That night, Jake made a decision that went against every instinct for self-preservation he had developed during 4 years of war. He was going to get Margaret out of that cellar, regardless of the consequences. But first, he needed to gather evidence that would protect them both when Colonel Thornfield inevitably came looking for revenge. The documents he had found in the storage building were just the beginning. Over the next few days, Jake systematically searched every corner of the ranch buildings, looking for additional evidence of Colonel Thornfield's financial situation and his treatment of his daughter. What he found painted a picture of a man on the edge of complete collapse, desperately trying to maintain control through increasingly violent means. The ranch's account books revealed debts that far exceeded anything Jake had imagined. Colonel Thornfield owed money to banks in 3 different cities, and his investments in railroad stock had lost nearly everything. Without Margaret's cooperation in an advantageous marriage or access to her mother's inheritance, the entire Thornfield empire would collapse within months. But it was a letter from Henry Wellington that provided the final piece of the puzzle. The banker's son had written to Colonel Thornfield just days after Margaret's imprisonment began, offering to reconsider his marriage proposal under certain conditions. The letter made it clear that Wellington was aware of the family's financial difficulties and was prepared to use that knowledge to his advantage. I am willing to overlook Miss Thornfield's previous rudeness, the letter read, provided she can be made to understand the necessity of our union. A properly chastened wife is often more valuable than an enthusiastic one, and I believe a period of reflection on her current circumstances might improve her disposition considerably. The casual cruelty of the proposition made Jake's hands shake with rage. Margaret wasn't just being punished for her defiance, she was being systematically broken down so that she would accept a marriage to a man who saw her humiliation as an asset rather than a tragedy. As Jake prepared for what he knew would be his final confrontation with Colonel Thornfield, he found himself thinking about the letters from Margaret's mother. Sarah Thornfield had died trying to protect her daughter from exactly this situation, and her sacrifice would be meaningless if Jake failed to act now. The truth was finally clear, and it was more horrifying than anyone had imagined. But truth, as Jake had learned during the war, was often the most dangerous weapon of all. The confrontation came at dawn on a morning when the valley lay shrouded in mist that rolled off the distant mountains like the breath of sleeping giants. Jake Morrison stood in the doorway of Colonel Thornfield's study, Sarah's hidden documents clutched in his weathered hands and 20 years of accumulated rage burning in his gray eyes. "Let her out," he said simply, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who had nothing left to lose. Colonel Thornfield looked up from his morning correspondence, his pale eyes narrowing as they took in Jake's determined stance. "I believe I dismissed you from your position, Morrison. You have no business in this house." "I have Margaret's mother's will," Jake replied, setting the yellowed papers on the polished desk between them. "And her letters?" "All of them." The color drained from the colonel's face as recognition dawned. He had searched for those documents for years, knowing they represented a threat to his control over Margaret's future. "Where did you find those?" "Does it matter?" Jake leaned forward, his scarred hands flat against the desk. "What matters is what they say. Margaret owns half this ranch, has since her 21st birthday. You've been stealing from your own daughter while slowly killing her in that cellar." Colonel Thornfield's hand moved instinctively toward his service revolver, but Jake was faster, his war-trained reflexes allowing him to grab the older man's wrist before the weapon could clear its holster. "I wouldn't," Jake said quietly. "Mrs. Cooper's already taken these papers to the sheriff. He's on his way here now with a federal marshal. Seems there are laws against imprisoning people, even your own family." The fight went out of Colonel Thornfield all at once, his military bearing collapsing like a structure with its foundation removed. For the first time, Jake saw him not as the terrifying patriarch who had dominated Margaret's life, but as a broken old man clinging to the wreckage of his own making. "I loved her," the colonel whispered, his voice cracking with something that might have been genuine grief. "Sarah. Margaret. I thought if I could make her strong enough, she'd survive what this world does to women like her mother." "You thought wrong," Jake said, but his voice had lost its edge. "Love doesn't break people into the shape you want them to be. Love accepts them as they are." The sound of approaching hoofbeats announced the arrival of the authorities. Jake released the colonel's wrist and stepped back, watching as years of pride and delusion finally crumbled under the weight of truth. Margaret emerged from the cellar like Lazarus from the tomb, blinking in the California sunshine and leaning heavily on Jake's strong arm. She was thin to the point of frailty, her face gaunt and her eyes holding the hollow look of someone who had stared into the abyss of despair and somehow found the strength to climb back out. "It's over," Jake murmured against her hair as she collapsed against his chest, her whole body shaking with the aftermath of trauma. "It's finally over." The legal proceedings that followed were swift, but thorough. Colonel Thornfield was charged with unlawful imprisonment and financial fraud, though his rapidly declining health made prosecution a moot point. Within 6 months he was dead from a heart attack brought on by the stress of his collapsed world. Margaret inherited not just her mother's property, but also the freedom to choose her own path forward. She and Jake were married in a simple ceremony attended by Mrs. Cooper and the ranch hands who had witnessed their love story unfold in the shadow of tyranny. They transformed the Thornfield Ranch into something Sarah Thornfield had dreamed of, a place where people could find sanctuary from the cruelties of the world. Margaret established a school for children whose circumstances had denied them education, while Jake created programs to help war veterans struggling with their own demons. Years later, as Margaret watched their own children play in the same fields where she had once labored as her father's prisoner, she often thought about the strange alchemy that could transform suffering into compassion, trauma into strength. "Love doesn't own," she would tell her students. "Love liberates, and sometimes the greatest act of love is refusing to be broken by those who claim they're breaking you for your own good." In the end, the Thornfield name became synonymous not with wealth or power, but with something far more valuable: the radical notion that every person deserves to be loved exactly as they are. This story touches the deepest truth many of us learned too late in life, that love should never feel like a prison sentence. How many of us spent decades believing that suffering for family was noble, that accepting cruelty was loyalty, that our worth depended on shrinking ourselves to fit others' expectations. Margaret's journey from her father's prisoner to Jake's equal partner mirrors what so many American families have experienced: the painful recognition that sometimes the people who claim to love us most are the ones destroying us slowly, one lesson at a time. We've all known a Colonel Thornfield. Perhaps we were one ourselves, believing that breaking our children would make them stronger, that controlling meant caring. But true love, as Jake showed Margaret, doesn't demand transformation. It celebrates who you already are. It doesn't punish your dreams, it builds ladders to reach them. After decades of marriages where we walked on eggshells, of children who stopped calling because home felt like judgment, of friendships lost to expectations we could never meet. This story reminds us it's never too late to choose different. Love should feel like coming home, not like preparing for war. Discussion questions. Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and your own well-being? What did you learn from that experience? Looking back, was there someone in your life who loved you unconditionally, like Jake loved Margaret? And how did that change you? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.